Good evening, and welcome to all who are here tonight to support and discuss and encourage values. I accepted this invitation tonight for two reasons. The first is because I think there is too little discussion in our nation today about the role that the values that we believe in play both within our country and in the role that America must play around the world. Second was because Shmuley asked me, and if I said no, I would never hear the end of it. So it is both morally based and practically based when you're the governor of New Jersey. When I first became governor, one of the first things I discovered was to inherit an extraordinarily large budget deficit, an $11 billion deficit on a $29 billion budget. By percentage, the largest budget deficit of any state in the country. And you know that when you first get the opportunity to lead, people will challenge you. They're testing you. And this is whether you're the mayor of a small town, the governor of a complex state, or the leader of the free world. You will be challenged and tested, and I was by my colleagues in the legislature who wanted to see who I was and what I would do. And so in the beginning, they suggested that the best way to fix this budget deficit was to increase taxes on the people of New Jersey, which had been done some 120 times over the past decade. And I said that I wouldn't do that. And the president of the New Jersey State Senate told me that any budget I sent to him would be dead on arrival if it didn't include a tax increase. So I decided that it was time for us to have a personal conversation about it. So I called him in. I said to him, listen, you all can do whatever you want. They had closed the government on Governor Corzine 4 years earlier for refusing to raise taxes higher than he wanted to. I told him he was welcome to do that, but that I had a very easy solution to it. That when they did that, I would veto the bill, and if they closed down the government because of it, that I would leave the State House, get in those black Suburbans they drive you around in as governor, go back to the governor's mansion, order a pizza, open a beer, and watch the Mets. And they could call me back when they were ready. Now, to show you that I was willing to sacrifice, I said, watch the Mets. All right, as a Mets fan, anyone out there who knows what I mean, again today, that is sacrifice, baby, real sacrifice. What happened was that they ultimately, the budget they said was dead on arrival when they knew I was serious and I vetoed the tax increase and sent it back to them, was returned to me with 99.8% of the line items just as I had presented them to them in February, passed by a Democratic legislature. Your values, no matter where they come from, will be tested. And people need to know that you'll stand up and stand for the things you believe in. And no matter what it is they choose to test you on first, believe me, it applies to everything else. Look at what happened to President Reagan in the beginning of his term, when air traffic controllers said they were going to go on strike despite the fact that the law prevented them from doing so. And President Reagan gave them a reasonable period of time to return to work and said if they didn't return to work in that period of time, they would all be fired. And people across the country and in Congress said he'll never do it. He did it, and it set the tone for the rest of his presidency, not only just in America, but around the world. That when Ronald Reagan stood up for a value that he thought was important, that he would stand for that value. What's happened now in our country and in America's role around the world, in my opinion, in the last 5 years, has been that missing element. No one understands any longer who America stands with or against. No one really understands exactly what we'll stand for and what we are willing to sacrifice to stand up for it. Leadership at home and abroad is the indispensable part of a moral world. You see, around the world now, America sets a bad example in two different ways. First, we do not have our domestic house in order. We are and have become a dysfunctional government that even our own people snicker, laugh at, ignore, and are disgusted by. It was a time in this world when America's government was something to emulate for people around the world. That the way we operated, the way we reached compromise, the way we settled disagreement, and the way we moved forward as a civil society was to be emulated around the world. That people in developing democracies, or those who aspire to liberty and freedom, look to America not only for those aspirations, but for how to execute on those aspirations. No one can realistically believe today, when we have Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C., who not only don't govern but barely speak to each other, that we're any longer the model for the world. And what does that lead to even further when the world looks at America? What it leads to is for them to believe that if America can't solve its own problems, what business does America have in telling us how to solve ours? The failure of domestic tranquility and governance leads to the diminishment of America's role in the world. Secondly, America is no longer sending clear signals to the world, consistent signals. Signals like the ones Ronald Reagan sent when he was president, as to who our friends are, and that we will stand with them without doubt, and to who our enemies are, who we will oppose regardless of the cost. We see it over and over and over again in the last 5 years in example after example after example. Syria was mentioned earlier. There could be folks in this audience, and I'm sure there would be, who would debate whether or not the president should draw a red line as he did in Syria, but here's something that should not be up to debate. That once you draw that red line, you enforce it. Because if you don't, America's credibility will be at stake and will be at risk all over the world, and we see the mischief that's being played because America is no longer standing up for the things they say they will stand up for. And believe me, sometimes those things are not popular to do and they're not easy to do. If you worry every day about what position you are in an opinion poll, you can't govern and you can't lead. I speak about this from personal experience. I've been in the 40s and I've been in the 70s. The 70s are better than the 40s. But if you sell your soul to get to the 70s, then what do you do once you get there? You're rudderless, without a vision, without an idea of what you will spend the 70s on to lead a nation and a world in the right direction. And so what do we see as we survey the world? We see Russian activism once again rearing its head in the world. We see an America that backed away from a commitment made by the President of the United States in Syria. We see a country, our country, permitting even the thought of a terrorist state like Iran having a nuclear capability. It's unthinkable that the America that has led in the way it has always led this world would permit that to happen. Yet we are sitting in a world, we are watching the vacuum that the lack of American leadership has created being filled. And it is almost never filled by virtue. It is almost always filled by evil. And the rest of the world watches in desperation and hope that America will realize and act upon, once again, its indispensable place in the world, which is not just to be the strongest economic power, not just to be the strongest military power, but most importantly, to be the strongest moral power for what is good and what is right in the world. That's why I'm here tonight. That's why I'm here. The values that Shmuley discussed in his speech are the values that America was founded upon and in its best moments has always stood for, fought for, and died for. America was never a place where our friends had to wonder whether we would stand next to them and fight with them. But I fear that as each day of ambivalence and rationalization goes by, in the name of just getting through the next day, that we pull further and further away from an America that must lead the world. There should be no doubt in the minds of anyone here that this is the state we find our country in right now. Regrettable as it is, sad as it is the truth. And we need to speak that truth loudly and clearly. Foreign policy and America's role in the world is something that's often not popular to discuss in political campaigns. But I suspect that every person who's had the opportunity to lead this country recognizes fairly early on that it is that role that will define the character and the strength of their leadership. Economies go up and down. Unemployment rates go up and down. GDP goes up and down. And yes, leadership can play a role in making sure that that either goes in the right direction or the wrong direction. But ultimately, the greatest moments in American history, in my opinion, have been determined by when the true heart and soul of the American people have been embodied in their leaders. Our love for our fellow man, the value we place on freedom and liberty, and the intrinsic God-given value of human life. We need to stand once again loudly for these values, and sometimes that's going to mean standing in some very messy, difficult places, and standing strong and hard for those things that we believe in, and it will mean sacrifice from the people of our country. But it is time in every respect, whether it's our national debt, our out-of-control entitlement system, our unreformed tax system, or our failure to send strong, clear signals and, more importantly, strong, clear action on behalf of our friends at risk around the world. It's time for our leaders to stop singing a happy tune to the American people about the condition of our country. It is time for us to tell the truth about that condition and then to begin taking the hard and firm actions that are necessary to fix it. And that will mean making sure that no matter where it is around the world or here at home, that we stand and we stand firmly, clearly and resolutely. In the end, the values that we celebrate tonight are not easy to stand up for, but are our moral obligation to do so. I leave you tonight with this thought. If the people in this room don't stand up for these values, and if the people in this room do not demand that from their leaders America stands up for these values, what will come of the world? Who is out there that you will nominate to make sure that justice is done around the world, that lives are protected, and that liberty and freedom is not only protected where it is, but is pushed forward in the places where people only dream of it. In the last nearly 240 years, it has been America that has stood for those values, fought for those values, bled for those values, and led. We've had great allies and partners, but we must lead. And so to all the people here tonight, I say to you, thank you for your willingness to do what you do every day to stand up for these values, but I urge you that it isn't enough, because we're not making it. And it's not just good enough to say that we've tried, we must succeed. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and those around the world are depending on us. John Adams once said near the end of his life, "You shall never know the price we have paid to secure for you your liberty. Make a good use of it. For if you do not, I shall repent in heaven for ever having made the sacrifice at all." We should not allow our generation to be the generation, the first generation, that makes great men like Adams repent in heaven for making the sacrifice that he, his family, and his colleagues made for this country at our formation. It is now our turn. The torch is firmly in our hand. And we will either lead or disappoint. Those are the only two choices. Unfortunately, today, in my opinion, America is disappointing, but it's not too late. It is time for us to stand up once again and lead our nation in a way that leads us to greater success and prosperity, and lead the world towards greater liberty, freedom, prosperity, and respect for human life. The people in this room can help to make that happen, and I'm glad to call myself one of you. Thank you very much.